Hello, everybody. Thank you to the organizers for inviting me to speak here today. I'm Irena Gorski-Steiner, and today this talk will be about the association of unconventional natural gas development with asthma. So I'll start with a background on unconventional natural gas development, which I'll be abbreviating here as UNGD, and why scientists have studied it in association with asthma. Why do they think it should be associated, and why they found that it is? Then we'll review some epidemiologic studies, not only of asthma, but also of associated respiratory symptoms. And we'll finally summarize what we know as a whole and some future directions for study in this area. So to give you a small peek at what UNGD looks like, here's a brief video of what one well pad looks like with truck traffic and light throughout the night. And that's natural gas flaring, which can be extremely loud and occur day and night. Unconventional natural gas development has dramatically expanded since 2000, mostly in the United States, and 25% of that in Pennsylvania. And here's a look at how the infrastructure is spread out in Pennsylvania. A lot of it is in the southwestern portion, and then also some in the northeastern portion. And before we jump into environmental epidemiology, let's just get on the same page that this is the study of the determinants of health-related states or events. And the general steps that epidemiologists use are using prior knowledge to develop hypotheses. Then they measure their environmental exposure of interest, which here is UNGD activity. And then they measure the health outcome, here being respiratory symptoms or asthma exacerbations. And finally, they use biostatistics to identify associations. And by doing this, they eliminate chance as an explanation for their findings, and they adjust for the influence of confounders to just get at their association of interest. So when we're thinking about how could UNGD be affecting asthma, first let's talk about what does UNGD activity entail? Well, it starts with well site preparation and road construction. This involves the clearing of land. This may be farmland or forested land. It's a lot of clearing. This involves a lot of truck trips and heavy machinery. And each well pad could include one to many wells. You then have the well drilling stage, which involves drilling down to the Marcellus Shale or other shale formation, which can be thousands of feet underground. And then the well drilled turns sideways and starts to stimulate, or also known as fracking, to break up the shale to extract the natural gas. And all of this involves a lot of chemicals and fluids, which once they return to the surface are stored in wastewater ponds. You then have the production of natural gas, and if the natural gas is deemed to be uneconomical, it can be flared, which was that really loud, bright light you saw in the video. Otherwise, the natural gas is processed and stored in compressor stations. There's also other infrastructure like separators and condensate tanks. And then the natural gas is transmitted through pipelines and other means to where it's used. And finally, you have well abandonment and site rehabilitation. So then the question becomes, to what then are humans exposed? What are the risks involved to humans that live nearby this activity? Well, there are individual exposures, everything from water, air, and soil contamination to physical hazards like the noise and the light, psychosocial hazards. There are community impacts to the built environment. There's a change in green space, change in roads, and therefore a change in traffic, change to the local social environment and economic environment based on who is being employed by the industry versus who may be living closer to them without receiving economic benefits. And finally, there's broader environmental threats, including the contribution to climate change and the cumulative impacts of all these wells that are being drilled over decades. One of the most relevant paths from UNGD to asthma is air pollution. And individually, emission sources can be small enough to avoid air pollution permitting and reporting requirements, but the cumulative impact of numerous small sources is considerable. So there can be elevated levels of volatile organic compounds, and near well pads, benzene levels can be very high. There's also fugitive emissions of methane, which means it's just released directly into the atmosphere. It's not flared and converted into carbon dioxide. And these levels can exceed or approach or exceed urban levels as a function of distance to well pads. But these air pollutants are not only coming from the well pads and the wells themselves, but also from the other infrastructure that I was mentioning, like the compressor stations. And now looking at risk factors for asthma exacerbations, air pollution and stress, which could be resulting from UNGD activity nearby, are both major triggers for asthma exacerbations, along with these other environmental and individual factors. So putting that all together, it is biologically plausible that these exposures from UNGD activity could be influencing and increasing the odds of asthma exacerbations. So moving on to the second step of our epidemiologic work, we measure UNGD activity, and the pathways most relevant to asthma, as we spoke about, are air pollution, which would be inhaled by humans, as well as stress from the noise, sleep disturbance, community impacts, etc. So should we try to capture all the relevant pathways at once or measure each one separately? So some people have proposed measuring air pollution directly from well pads and different infrastructure, but that is a lot of air pollution monitors and a lot of air pollutants to measure. And if we want to measure stress directly, that's a lot of people that we're measuring some sort of biomarker like cortisol in. And since there are so many pathways that are relevant to asthma, most scientists have used a metric to try and combine all the pathways. And some challenges to this are funding, as well as the fact that UNGD activity is past peak. So how can we do this retrospectively to capture that peak in UNGD activity? So as for measuring the health outcome of asthma or asthma exacerbations, we can use governmental databases. This will capture asthma exacerbations at the zip code to county level, because they're trying to remove, they're trying to give anonymity to people who are facing these health issues. There can also be the use of health records or surveys in order to get more individualized data. And then some challenges with this are it is difficult to obtain access to healthcare records because they are so protected by privacy concerns. And there's also a bias towards more severe events being recorded in some of these options for measuring, because you're not going to have somebody who has a small asthma exacerbation showing up at the hospital and therefore being reported in this. And finally, using biostatistics to identify these associations, we're trying to see if exposure to UNGD activity leads to an increased incidence, risk, or odds of asthma outcomes. So we've already reviewed the stages of UNGD activity and the exposures of interest. Now let's jump into the epidemiologic studies. Here's just some of the studies that have been conducted, not just in the area of asthma like we'll be talking about. A lot of studies have been conducted in the area of pregnancy, birth, and infant outcomes, and found everything from a higher prevalence of low birth weight to higher odds of fetal death. There's also been a few studies now on anxiety and depression, finding higher odds of mild depression symptoms in adults. And finally, what we're interested here today, the respiratory and other symptoms in asthma. So let's jump individually into these studies. The first one was conducted by Rabinowitz et al. In 2015. They surveyed 492 people in Washington County, Pennsylvania. They chose this because this county in particular has a very high density of drilling. And they surveyed them on past year health-related symptoms. They used a generalized linear mixed model adjusting for relevant confounders. And they found that proximity to UNGD wells was associated with a 3.1-fold increased odds of respiratory symptoms. You see the confidence interval there. It was a significant association. The second study was by Tustin et al. 2017. This was out of the lab that I'm a part of now. They used Geisinger electronic health records to select almost 24,000 patients, and they mailed them a 4-page questionnaire asking them about their symptoms. This was not sent out in relation to UNGD. It was sent out before this study was even conceptualized. So people were just reporting on their symptoms that they were experiencing. And then this research team decided to look at them in association with UNGD activities. So they geocoded them and assigned them their amount of activity they were exposed to. And they found that it was significantly associated with increased odds of nasal and sinus symptoms, but only in combination with fatigue or migraine. And here, the final symptom study that I'll be reviewing by Aspergis et al. 2021. This one's now the first one in Oklahoma. The other two have been in Pennsylvania. They use publicly available data for 76 counties in Oklahoma, and therefore it's an ecologic study at the county level. They adjusted for many confounders and used the common correlated effects method and found a 1% increase in the number of fracking wells in a county leads to a 5.9% increase in respiratory diseases. Now we can move specifically into asthma. This one was done by Rasmussen et al. 2016. This one is also out of my lab. And they identified almost 36,000 asthma patients ages 5 to 90 years in the early 2000s. And they assigned UNGD activity to each subject on the day before their asthma exacerbation. So they're looking at how much were they exposed to UNGD activity on day 1, and then is that associated with asthma exacerbation on day 2. And they compared patients with and without exacerbations and adjusted for other variables linked to asthma. They looked at 3 different asthma exacerbation outcomes. They defined a mild asthma exacerbation as a new oral corticosteroid order for asthma, and they identified a lot of these. They defined a moderate asthma exacerbation as an emergency department visit for asthma, and finally severe as a hospitalization for asthma. And the way they measured UNGD activity is one of those metrics which can incorporate the many different pathways. And it not only takes into account the distance from a residence to a well, which is often referred to as proximity, but it also takes into account the depth of a well and the total daily gas volume that's produced in order to get a bigger picture of what's going on near somebody's house. So these metrics that they used with this formula here, they get larger not only if there are wells closer to a residence, but also if there are more wells and or larger wells. And here are their results, looking at different phases of unconventional natural gas development, from the pad phase of developing a well pad to spudding or drilling, stim, which is the hydraulic fracturing phase, and prod, which is production of gas. And it's also, here they list the different types of asthma exacerbation outcomes. And what they found was that there was a higher odds of all 3 types of asthma exacerbations. And they found that all the different activity metrics, regardless of the phase, were associated with all 3 outcomes. They also did 2 sensitivity analyses in this study to check the robustness of their findings. So first, they took the UNGD activity metrics that they had already calculated and looked at it in association with an outcome that they thought would not make any sense to be associated with UNGD activity. They chose diarrheal illness in this case. This is called a negative outcome control analysis. And they found that UNGD was not associated with diarrheal illness. So this supports their finding that it's associated with a biologically plausible outcome and not associated with a not biologically plausible outcome. They also were concerned about spatial confounding. So they looked at the association of county with asthma exacerbations, and they also found this was not associated, which once again strengthens their main finding. The second study here was also done in Pennsylvania. It's by a research team with Willis et al. In 2018. They identified patients aged 2 to 18 years old with hospitalizations by zip code in Marcellus Shale counties of Pennsylvania. They split these up by zip code, quarter, and year, and identified acute asthma exacerbations by their hospital discharge code. And they used a difference in differences analysis adjust for other confounders. They measured UNGD activity in 4 different ways, and they evaluated each of these in association with their outcomes. They looked at a binary contemporaneous variable for newly spudded wells in a county, a binary cumulative variable for ever spudded wells by county, tertiles of cumulative count of wells ever drilled by county, and finally a metric that incorporated air pollutants as reported to an emissions inventory. They looked at this for all different well sites and brought this up to the county level. And their results showed that UNGD is associated with higher odds of pediatric asthma hospitalization. And because they found associations with each of their 4 metrics, they can also conclude that specific air pollutants from drilling emissions may be driving these associations. And they also looked at the association by year, and they found that associations remain for up to 8 years after drilling begins in a community. And here's the third and final study that's been done on UNGD activity and asthma. This one is done in Texas by the same research team that we just saw, Willis et al. And they looked at Texas hospitalizations for pediatric asthma by zip code level and quarter of year. And they calculated the cumulative density of natural gas development sites per square kilometer within a zip code. They stratified these metrics by conventional drilling versus unconventional. So thus far in this talk, I've only spoken about unconventional natural gas development, which entails the horizontal drilling and hydraulic fracturing components, whereas conventional is just vertical drilling and less energy intensive practices to extract natural gas. But here they looked at both. And they also assessed additional drilling specific exposures, including production and gas flaring. And they used logistic regression models to assess their associations by zip code quarter year. And what they found was that UNGD, the unconventional type of drilling, is associated with up to 59% increased odds of at least 1 pediatric asthma hospitalization in a zip code quarter. Meanwhile, conventional drilling associated with up to a 23% increased odds of these outcomes. Their association with flaring volumes was inconsistent. You can see it's only significant for the low metric here. And finally, increasing production values were associated with an increased hospitalization rate in an exposure response relationship. So as UNGD activity got higher, or as production volume got higher, there also was higher odds of their outcome. So beyond these epidemiologic studies, there also is the contribution of UNGD to climate change. It is an extraction of fossil fuels, and it's a very energy intensive process. And we know that climate change will also contribute to asthma's burden. So this has not been specifically evaluated for UNGD, but it's also something to note. So reviewing these studies as a whole, some strengths of them include that they found associations that are robust to increasing covariate control. They adjusted for all different things that are associated with asthma and still found that the association with UNGD activity held. They also each did their own sensitivity analyses. And as we spoke about, the associations are biologically plausible. And when they tested associations of UNGD activity with implausible outcomes, they found no association, which is a strength here. There's also a large sample size in many studies. And there's now a growing number of studies showing associations from different regions of the US. We had Pennsylvania, Oklahoma, and Texas covered just in these studies. And there are emerging studies of related outcomes in Colorado. They used different designs, and there were different groups of investigators all coming to very similar conclusions. Some challenges of these studies are that these results provide little guidance about what regulations might reduce risk. We don't know if any improvements that have been made for safety in the past few years have led to a decreased burden. We also cannot identify mechanisms. We don't know if these associations are due to air pollution or stress or a combination because of the way that UNGD activity was measured. And finally, ongoing threats to science are also a challenge for ongoing scientific efforts in this area. So some future directions for scientists interested in further evaluating this association are to conduct studies in additional shale basins. Like I said, Pennsylvania was well covered here, but there's only one study each in Oklahoma and Texas, and there's a lot of additional hydraulic fracturing and unconventional natural gas development going on in the US, where other studies can be conducted to make sure that these findings are generalizable across different geographic areas and therefore different industry practices. Studies can also be designed to evaluate how regulations might minimize the impact of UNGD on public health and specifically asthma. And finally, studies can evaluate potential pathways. So looking at if it's air pollution or stress that's driving it. They can do this by improving the exposure metrics with environmental measurements and biomarkers. As we spoke about earlier, this is difficult to do since we're past peak with UNGD. Does it make sense to do this all now? Can we get biomarkers at the right time to capture the relevant exposure to UNGD in relation to a health outcome? We kind of have to know where activity is going to be going on and collect before and after. So it gets really challenging, but this could be a future pathway if a lot of funding were available and somebody were interested in doing this. So the main takeaway here that I want you to walk away from is that UNGD activity has been found to be associated with increased odds of respiratory symptoms, as well as several measurements of asthma exacerbations. This is supported by all the epidemiologic studies that we reviewed. I'd like to thank the many people who have advised me and contributed to the content that I've reviewed. And please feel free to contact me at this email address. And thank you.